The Imperium of Man does not believe in accidents. It believes in intention, in divine purpose, in a universe ordered by the will of the Emperor himself. Every victory is proof of his design. Every catastrophe is blamed on heresy, xenos interference, or the eternal malice of the warp. There is comfort in this belief, because it suggests that disasters have enemies, things that can be fought, named, and purged. But there is a far more terrifying possibility the Imperium refuses to acknowledge, that some of its greatest wounds were self-inflicted, not by rebellion but by obedience. Across a million worlds, the Imperium survives not through heroism but through paperwork. Ink and data script move more armies than any warmaster ever could. Entire planets live or die based on tithes calculated by minds that will never see their skies. Star systems are fortified, abandoned, or erased from strategic priority not because of battles fought, but because of numbers entered correctly, or incorrectly, into an ancient system no one fully understands anymore. This is the true machinery of the Imperium, not bolters or battleships, but forms, audits, classifications, and seals. The Emperor knew this. Long before his body was entombed upon the Golden Throne, he understood that empires are not sustained by warriors alone. They are sustained by systems. Systems require order. Order requires records. And records, inevitably, require people small enough to be trusted with them. People so insignificant that their decisions are never questioned. People whose loyalty is measured not by courage but by accuracy. It is comforting to believe that only primarchs shape history. That galaxy-shattering events require galaxy-shattering figures. The Imperium teaches this myth carefully. It names its heroes, glorifies its martyrs, and catalogs its traitors with obsessive detail. But for every name carved into marble, there are a billion more erased before they are ever written. And sometimes, it is those erased names that matter most. Somewhere in the vastness of the Imperium's archives, buried beneath millennia of redundant backups and corrupted data stacks, there once existed a single inspection report. It was not marked as urgent. It was not classified as sacred or restricted. It was filed, approved, and archived according to procedure. No alarms sounded when it was completed. No visions troubled the psychers of Terra. No astropath screamed a warning across the void. The Imperium did not even notice when it happened. That report concerned a planet that did not matter. At least, that is what the records said. The planet's name, long since redacted, appeared no different from the countless others processed each solar day. Its population figures were within acceptable deviation. Its tithe grades were unremarkable. Its compliance status was stable, its orbital defenses adequate, its faith in the Emperor officially sufficient. Nothing about it suggested importance. Nothing demanded scrutiny. And yet, that planet existed within a web of decisions far older and far more fragile than any clerk assigned to inspect it could ever have imagined. The man who inspected it did not wake that day believing he would change the fate of humanity. He did not feel chosen. He did not feel cursed. He believed, with absolute sincerity, that his only purpose was to ensure the Imperium functioned exactly as intended. He believed that errors were sins, that inaccuracies were betrayals, and that precision was the purest form of devotion. In this, he was no different from countless others. The Imperium rewards this kind of thinking. It teaches its servants that obedience is salvation, that questioning is dangerous, and that faith lies in trust of the system rather than understanding it. The clerk trusted the system completely. He trusted that every planet was classified correctly, that every redaction had a reason, that every inconsistency was intentional, not accidental. And when he found something that did not fit, he did not suspect a grand design. He suspected a mistake. That was his first error. In the Imperium, mistakes are not corrected by asking why they exist. They are corrected by removing them. The system does not want to be understood. It wants to be clean. And so the clerk did what he had been trained to do since his first day of service. He followed procedure. He compared records. He reconciled discrepancies. He selected the most recent and reliable data, and with a few carefully authorized inputs, he brought order to chaos. He had no way of knowing that the chaos was intentional. Long before the Imperium forgot why certain worlds were hidden behind contradictory data, the Emperor had understood something vital about humanity's future. He had known that some threats could not be destroyed, only delayed. That some dangers could not be fought openly, only buried beneath layers of misdirection and administrative obscurity. He had built these deceptions into the Imperium itself, trusting that its sheer size and inertia would protect what needed to remain unseen. But the Emperor had also trusted his servants to be imperfect. He did not anticipate perfection. The inspection was approved. The classification was updated. The planet was reassigned a new status, more logical, more efficient, and catastrophically wrong. The data propagated outward through the Administratum systems, copied and confirmed by machines that no longer questioned authority. Supply routes adjusted, military priorities shifted, watchfulness faded, not because of negligence, but because the records now said it was unnecessary. Nothing exploded, nothing burned. For years, nothing happened at all. And that was the most damning outcome of all. Because in the Imperium of Man, silence is not peace. It is merely the pause before something ancient remembers it has been forgotten. The answer is not glory. It is not faith. And it is certainly not truth. The Imperium remembers itself through records, endless, suffocating layers of data compiled over 10,000 years of war, decay, and desperation. If you stay with this story until the very end, you'll uncover how this silent machinery, not a battlefield, not a traitor, became the most dangerous weapon ever turned against the Emperor's own design. The Imperium of Man is often imagined as a realm of constant fire and fury, but in reality, it is held together by something far more fragile, consensus written into stone and data. For every Space Marine chapter, there are entire planets devoted to administration alone. For every Crusade fleet, there are vaults of parchment and cogitator stacks so vast that no living human has ever seen them in their entirety. This is the Adeptus Administratum, the beating, bloated heart of imperial survival. Within its halls, time does not move forward. It piles up. Records from the Great Crusade sit beside fresh casualty reports, indistinguishable except for the corrosion of age. Decisions made in desperation millennia ago are treated with the same authority as current commands, because the Imperium no longer remembers why many of those decisions were made in the first place. It only remembers that they were made by someone, somewhere, who was trusted at the time. And so the system persists. Planetary inspections are not heroic undertakings. They are not investigations in the modern sense. They are reconciliations, attempts to force reality to align with expectation. A planet is not evaluated by what it truly is, but by how closely it matches what the Imperium already believes it to be. Population counts are adjusted to fit tide projections. Deviations are smoothed over. Anomalies are flagged, not to be explored, but to be resolved as efficiently as possible. This is not corruption. This is orthodoxy. The Administratum does not seek truth, because truth creates uncertainty. It seeks consistency. A consistent lie is more useful to the Imperium than an inconvenient fact. After all, the Imperium does not have the luxury of rethinking itself. It must continue, no matter the cost, no matter the errors embedded in its foundations. To stop and question would be to admit weakness, and weakness invites extinction. That is why clerks are trained the way they are. From their earliest indoctrination, they are taught that their purpose is not understanding, but alignment. Their role is not to ask why something exists, but to ensure it fits where it has been placed. If two records contradict each other, the older one is not sacred. The newer one is not suspect. The one that creates the least disruption is the correct one. This philosophy has saved the Imperium countless times. It has also doomed it, repeatedly. The clerk at the center of this story was one of trillions who believed in this system with absolute conviction. He did not think of himself as small. He thought of himself as precise. Every corrected line of data was, to him, an act of service. Every resolved inconsistency was proof that the Imperium could still impose order on a universe determined to tear itself apart. What he did not understand, what he could not understand, was that some inconsistencies are not errors. They are warnings. The Emperor had never trusted humanity to remember everything. He had trusted it to forget selectively. Certain worlds were buried under contradictory reports on purpose. Their importance diluted by clerical noise. Their true function hidden not behind secrecy, but behind boredom. The perfect camouflage in an empire drowning in its own information was to look unimportant. And the Administratum, in its endless drive toward efficiency, was slowly stripping that camouflage away. By the time the clerk opened the relevant files, the damage had already begun centuries earlier. He was not the first to touch the records. He was simply the first to notice that they did not make sense. And in an empire where sense itself had become sacred, that was enough to justify intervention. He believed the Imperium was sick with error. He believed he was curing it. And somewhere, deep within the Emperor's long-abandoned contingencies, a safeguard quietly failed, without alarms, without omens, and without mercy. Because when an empire teaches its servants that obedience is virtue and curiosity is sin, it should never be surprised when someone obediently destroys the future while trying to make the present more orderly. To understand how everything went wrong, you must first understand the kind of person the Imperium depends on most, the kind it never celebrates, never remembers, and never forgives. The Imperium does not survive on heroes alone. Heroes are expensive. Heroes are unpredictable. What the Imperium truly requires is endurance in human form. Men and women who can sit in the same place for decades, performing the same tasks, never asking whether what they are doing still matters. The clerk was one of these people, shaped by an empire that valued continuity over compassion and accuracy over understanding. He was born on a world that existed solely to produce more workers for the Administratum. It had no history worth preserving, no culture worth recording beyond basic compliance metrics. From childhood, his life was governed by schedules, quotas, and evaluations. Education was not meant to inspire curiosity, it was meant to eliminate deviation. He learned how to read High Gothic not to enjoy its meaning, but to recognize its structure. He learned numbers not to question them, but to reconcile them. By the time he was old enough to serve, his greatest fear was not punishment or death, it was being wrong. That fear followed him into adulthood and became the cornerstone of his faith. The Imperium preaches that the Emperor protects, but it rarely explains how. For clerks, protection comes through process. Through checklists. Through procedures refined over millennia. The clerk believed, truly and deeply, that if every step was followed precisely, disaster could be avoided. In his mind, wars were caused by mistakes made long before the first shot was fired, mistakes buried in logistics, supply chains, and misfiled data. If those mistakes could be eliminated, then perhaps the Imperium could finally rest. This belief made him exceptional. Not because it was rare, but because he never let it weaken. Many clerks grow numb. They learn to accept contradictions as normal, to push troubling files aside rather than confront them. The system quietly rewards this behavior. Efficiency is measured in output, not accuracy. The clerk, however, could not ignore inconsistencies. They lingered in his thoughts long after his shift ended. He replayed figures in his mind, comparing dates, cross-referencing codes. Where others saw harmless noise, he saw infection. So when his reassignment came through, a routine transfer of inspection duties across several minor systems, he accepted it without hesitation. Transfers were common, and questioning them was discouraged. To ask why you were moved was to imply that the system might be wrong. The clerk trusted that the system knew best. If he was needed elsewhere, then elsewhere must require correction. The assignment itself was unremarkable. A cluster of worlds with low strategic value, minimal military presence, and stable tide compliance. The kind of place inspections were sent not to discover anything new, but to confirm that nothing had changed. This was meant to be busywork, a box to be checked and forgotten. And for the first several worlds, that is exactly what it was. Then he reached the planet. At first glance, it was no different from the others. Its designation followed standard conventions. Its population figures fluctuated within acceptable margins. Its tide history showed no signs of rebellion or shortage. But the deeper he looked, the more the data refused to align. Census numbers from different centuries contradicted each other in subtle ways. Supply records referenced infrastructure that no longer appeared in current surveys. Entire decades were summarized in single lines, as though someone had deliberately compressed time itself. These were not errors that triggered alarms. They were too small for that. Too mundane. But to the clerk, they stood out like stains on sacred parchment. He did what he had been trained to do. He began cross-referencing. That was when he noticed the redactions. Not the dramatic kind, no warnings of heresy or inquisitorial seals. Just quiet omissions. Fields left blank where data should have been mandatory. References to archived annexes that no longer existed. Compliance certifications renewed automatically without accompanying inspection notes. It was as if generations of clerks had touched these records, sensed something was wrong, and then collectively agreed not to look too closely. The clerk did not interpret this as caution. He interpreted it as negligence. In his mind, the Imperium was suffering not from too much rigidity, but from too much decay. Standards had slipped. Oversight had weakened. If something had been ignored for centuries, then correcting it was not only acceptable, it was necessary. The Emperor demanded vigilance, and vigilance meant confronting disorder wherever it appeared. What the clerk did not realize was that he was standing at the edge of a deliberate blind spot in imperial history. Somewhere, long before his birth, someone far more powerful than him had decided that this planet was safer when misunderstood. That its importance was better concealed behind bureaucratic confusion than protected by force. That the Imperium's greatest shield was not secrecy, but apathy. And that as long as no one cared enough to clean the records, the planet would remain exactly where it needed to be. The clerk cared. And in an empire built to crush curiosity, caring was the most dangerous flaw of all. The clerk did not act rashly. That is what makes what followed so devastating. He did not falsify records, ignore protocol, or exceed his jurisdiction in any obvious way. Every action he took was permitted. Every correction he made was justified by precedent. The tragedy was not born from rebellion, but from diligence carried to its logical extreme. He began by isolating the planet's file from the surrounding system data. This alone took weeks. The Administratum's records were not designed for clarity, they were designed for permanence. Every update layered itself over the past rather than replacing it. To see a single world clearly required peeling back centuries of revisions, annotations, and machine-generated summaries. Most clerks lacked the patience for this. The clerk did not. What he found only reinforced his growing unease. The planet's tithe obligations had been adjusted repeatedly without explanation. At certain points in its history, its output was mysteriously reduced, even though population figures suggested it could sustain far more. Military presence had fluctuated wildly, entire regiments stationed there for short periods, then withdrawn without record of engagement. Naval patrols appeared and vanished from deployment logs as though erased mid-thought. To the clerk, this was madness. The Imperium, he believed, was inefficient but never irrational. Resources were scarce. Lives were precious in their own brutal way. You did not divert fleets or suppress tithes without cause. And yet here was a planet that seemed to exist outside the normal logic of imperial governance. Not protected, not exploited, simply managed poorly. The possibility that this was intentional did not occur to him. He flagged the discrepancies internally, submitting standard inquiries through channels that had not been meaningfully staffed in centuries. Automated responses returned, stamped and sealed, confirming that the data had been reviewed previously and required no further action. For most clerks, that would have been the end of it. The system had spoken. The Emperor's will, mediated through machinery and tradition, had been affirmed. But the clerk noticed something else. The confirmations were all identical. Word for word, seal for seal, generated by the same subroutine, drawing authority from records older than the Imperium's current calendar. To him, this was not reassurance. It was proof that no living mind had reviewed the planet's status in an unthinkable span of time. The safeguards meant to prevent error had become echoes, repeating decisions made by people long dead, for reasons no longer remembered. This was unacceptable. The clerk believed that decay was the greatest threat facing the Imperium, not chaos, not xenos, but stagnation masquerading as tradition. If no one intervened, then eventually the system would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. And so, armed with nothing but his training and his faith in procedure, he prepared to do what countless others had avoided. He prepared to normalize the records. Normalization was a sacred concept within the Administratum. It meant aligning data with current standards, eliminating anomalies, and ensuring that every planet could be easily categorized, assessed, and deployed as needed. Normalized worlds were predictable. Predictability meant control. Control meant survival. The clerk began with population metrics, averaging out conflicting census reports and discarding those deemed outdated or unreliable. He adjusted production estimates to match the newly established figures. Then came the most critical step, classification. Planetary classification determined everything: tithe level, military oversight, strategic priority. It was the lens through which the Imperium viewed a world. And the clerk, after exhaustive comparison, reached what seemed to him an obvious conclusion. The planet was overvalued. Its historical treatment did not match its measurable output. It had been given attention it did not deserve. He reclassified it accordingly. Deep within ancient cogitator cores, routines written by minds far greater than his began to encounter inconsistencies of a different kind. Projections that had once balanced now drifted. Contingency thresholds were crossed without triggering responses, because the planet tied to them no longer held the necessary classification weight. Safeguards designed to activate under specific conditions remained dormant, waiting for signals that would never arrive. The Emperor's design did not fail all at once. It frayed. Elsewhere in the sector, phenomena began to shift. Warp routes grew subtly unstable, not enough to provoke alarm, but enough to lengthen transit times. Astropaths reported faint disturbances, whispers at the edge of perception that could not be traced to any known source. These reports were filed, cross-referenced, and dismissed as local variants. After all, the data did not support a larger pattern. The data had been corrected. What no one understood was that the planet had never been important because of what it produced, or how many lived upon it. It had been important because of what it anchored. It was a quiet node in a vast and delicate network, one of many pressure points designed to absorb forces the Imperium could not afford to confront directly. Its obscurity had been its shield. Now, without oversight or reinforcement, that shield was thinning. The first true casualty was not a world or a fleet, but a margin of error. A tolerance built into the Emperor's long-abandoned calculations slipped past its limit. The system compensated, as it always did, redistributing strain elsewhere. Each compensation created new imbalances, each one small enough to be ignored, each one compounding the last. From the outside, the Imperium appeared unchanged. Inside, something ancient and patient began to notice the absence. And far away, in a data vault that would never again be opened, the clerk's correction sat perfectly indexed, an exemplar of administrative excellence, and the moment the Emperor's grand plan began to fail in earnest. The answer, in the Imperium of Man, is usually centuries later, long after the hands that made it have turned to dust. By the time the consequences of the clerk's action began to surface in a way that could no longer be ignored, no one alive remembered why the planet had ever been treated differently in the first place. The records were clean, the classifications were sound, and so, when reality began to diverge from expectation, the Imperium did what it always did: it blamed reality. The first official notice came in the form of a routine anomaly report. A minor trade route disruption. Nothing dramatic. Ships delayed by unpredictable warp turbulence, their navigators reporting distortions that did not match established charts. These incidents were logged, compared against regional averages, and dismissed. The warp was capricious by nature. To expect consistency from it was foolish. The Administratum marked the events as statistically insignificant. Then the reports multiplied. Not enough to cause panic. Not enough to demand investigation. Just enough to be inconvenient. A supply convoy vanished without trace, its last transmission distorted beyond recovery. A listening post went silent, its astropathic choir reduced to incoherent whispers before communications ceased entirely. Each incident, taken alone, was unremarkable. Together, they formed a pattern that no one was looking for anymore. Because the planet was no longer marked as important. Had it retained its former status, had even a trace of its intentional obscurity survived, these disturbances might have been flagged as deviations from a known containment zone. Watchers might have been dispatched. Inquiries might have been made. But the planet now existed in the Imperium's mind as ordinary. And ordinary worlds are allowed to suffer quietly. Local authorities began sending increasingly desperate messages. Infrastructure failures, atmospheric irregularities, civil unrest driven by shortages that could no longer be explained. The replies they received, when they received any at all, were procedural. Requests denied, forms returned for correction, instructions to resubmit through proper channels. The channels led nowhere. The clerk, by now older and more deeply embedded in the system, encountered none of these reports directly. His duties had expanded. His responsibilities had increased. He was trusted. Trusted clerks are shielded from noise. Only clean, actionable data reached his desk now. The system protected its most efficient servants from the mess they helped create. But cracks were forming even there. He noticed them first as minor discrepancies in unrelated files. Strategic forecasts that required more frequent revision. Resource models that no longer balanced without aggressive assumptions. Each correction demanded further corrections elsewhere, like a body compensating for an unseen wound. The Imperium was still functioning, but it was straining. This disturbed him. Not because he suspected his past actions, but because he believed the system should be stable. If it was not, then something had been neglected. Something was being mismanaged, and as he had done before, he felt compelled to find it. He began tracing anomalies backward. This was not encouraged. Senior clerks were expected to manage the present, not exhume the past. Historical context was a luxury the Imperium could not afford. But the clerk had always believed that understanding was the highest form of obedience. If the Emperor's domain was faltering, then the faithful response was to uncover why. The trail led him, slowly and reluctantly, back toward familiar data structures. Toward old classifications, old inspections, old corrections, toward his own work. At first, he did not recognize it. The files were too clean now, too orderly. His own annotations had been absorbed into the system, stripped of personal markers. But the logic was unmistakable. The assumptions matched his thinking. The normalization protocols bore his intellectual fingerprint. He had seen this pattern before, because he had created it. The realization did not strike him like lightning. It crept. A cold, creeping awareness that the stability he had prized might have been artificial. That the disorder he had erased might have been intentional. That the planet he had corrected might not have been mismanaged, but protected. The clerk searched for justification. Surely if the planet had been critical, safeguards would have existed. Surely the Emperor would not entrust something so vital to obscurity alone. Surely someone, somewhere, would have noticed before now. But the deeper he looked, the worse it became. He found fragments, half-corrupted references to contingency doctrines no longer taught. Mentions of strategic silence, of threats that could not be named without being empowered. The language was archaic, the meaning deliberately vague. But one thing was clear, the planet had not been an asset. It had been a lock. And locks are only noticed when they fail. By the time the clerk understood this, it was far too late. The mechanisms that had depended on that world's quiet existence were already collapsing. Forces long contained by neglect and misdirection were no longer bound by either. The Imperium, blind to its own past, was reacting exactly as it always did, deploying armies, issuing edicts, escalating conflict. It was fighting the symptom, not the cause. The clerk sat alone with this knowledge, surrounded by the very system he had trusted his entire life. There was no form to submit for this kind of error. No protocol for undoing a truth buried under centuries of obedience. To admit what he had done would not trigger a response, it would trigger erasure. And so he remained silent. As the Imperium began to burn in ways it could not explain, one man finally understood the true horror of his mistake, that he had not defied the Emperor's will. He had fulfilled it too perfectly. And in doing so, he had ensured that when the Emperor's grand plan finally failed, no one would ever know why. The clerk did not sleep after that realization. Sleep required the illusion of innocence, and that illusion had been stripped away with brutal efficiency. Every corridor he walked now felt narrower, every cogitator hummed louder, as if the Administratum itself had become aware of his doubt and was quietly measuring him for removal. He had spent his life believing that knowledge brought clarity. Now he understood that in the Imperium, knowledge brought danger. He tried to tell himself that he was wrong. That the fragments he had uncovered were misinterpretations, relics of outdated doctrines rendered obsolete by progress. The Imperium had survived 10,000 years of catastrophe, surely it did not hinge on one forgotten world. Surely the Emperor's design was more resilient than that. But deep down, beneath layers of indoctrination and habit, he knew this was a lie. The Imperium survived not because it was strong, but because it was redundant. And redundancy, once removed, never announced its absence until the moment it was needed. The first undeniable confirmation came not from a file, but from an emergency override. Overrides were rare. They required authority so ancient that most clerks believed them mythical. When one activated, it meant that something had gone catastrophically outside expected parameters. The clerk watched in silence as priority channels lit up with data streams marked by seals he had only seen in training simulations. Sector-wide alerts. Strategic recalculations issued directly from Terra. The Imperium was reacting, clumsily, violently, to a threat it did not understand. The language used was telling. There was no mention of containment failure. No reference to legacy safeguards or dormant contingencies. Instead, the threat was categorized as emergent, unforeseen, external. The Imperium had no memory of having prepared for this moment, and so it treated it as something new, something to be crushed rather than endured. That was when the clerk understood the final, most terrible truth. The Emperor's plan had never been about winning. It had been about delaying. Whatever had been bound, buried, or obscured by that planet was not something the Imperium could destroy outright, not without paying a price it could not afford. The plan had been to outlast it, to starve it of attention, to let it exist in a blind spot where it could do the least harm. The Imperium's greatest weapon against it had not been firepower, but neglect. And the clerk had taken that weapon away. As fleets mobilized and armies were redirected, the balance tipped irrevocably. The thing that had once been contained by indifference now found itself acknowledged. Studied, targeted, And in the warp, attention was never neutral. To be noticed was to be empowered. To be named was to be invited. Reports grew darker. Entire systems destabilized within months. Worlds went silent faster than evacuation protocols could be issued. The Imperium responded with overwhelming force, as it always did, and achieved exactly what it always achieved in such situations: escalation. Each act of suppression fed the very phenomenon it sought to eliminate. The clerk submitted no reports. He issued no warnings. He understood. Now that there was no language left in the Imperium capable of expressing the truth he had uncovered. To explain that the disaster was not an invasion, not a rebellion, but the consequence of administrative clarity would be to confess a heresy more profound than treason, the heresy of imperfection in the Emperor's design. Such a confession would not save lives. It would only add one more name to the list of those erased. And so the clerk did what the Imperium had trained him to do better than anything else. He disappeared. Not physically, not at first. He continued to report to his station, continued to perform his duties with mechanical precision. But inwardly, he withdrew. He stopped seeking correction, stopped reconciling deeper contradictions. He let errors persist where once he would have erased them, hoping, futilely, that some fragment of the old obscurity might return. It did not. The damage had passed the point where silence could protect anything. In distant sectors, wars ignited with no clear cause. Commanders fought shadows they could not define. Inquisitors argued over classifications that no longer fit the threat they faced. And above it all, the Emperor remained silent, not in judgment but in inevitability. The clerk lived long enough to see the Imperium adapt, as it always did. New doctrines were written. New lies were standardized. The catastrophe was folded into history as just another tragedy among countless others. No one searched for a single point of failure. No one asked whether the disaster had been preventable. Because prevention would require admitting that the Imperium's greatest enemy was not chaos, nor xenos, nor even time itself. It was certainty. And somewhere, buried beneath perfect records and flawless procedures, the truth remained locked away forever, that the Emperor's grand plan had not been shattered by defiance or ambition, but by a loyal servant who loved order too much to leave well enough alone. The Imperium did what it had always done when faced with the incomprehensible: it rewrote the narrative. What could not be understood was reclassified. What could not be controlled was renamed. The unfolding catastrophe was no longer framed as the failure of a safeguard or the collapse of a contingency, but as the emergence of a new threat, one that justified extraordinary measures and absolved past decisions of blame. History, after all, was not a record of what happened. It was a tool for maintaining obedience. Sector councils convened, their deliberations guided by data already warped by the clerk's long-ago correction. They debated fleet movements and resource allocations without ever questioning the assumptions beneath them. The planet at the center of everything was mentioned only in passing, referenced as a peripheral world caught in unfortunate proximity to events beyond its control. No one asked why it had been left so exposed. The records said it had never been important. And so that became the truth. Military campaigns were launched with overwhelming force, striking at manifestations that were already too diffuse to be contained by violence. Each victory was declared proof of progress. Each loss was attributed to insufficient commitment. The Imperium escalated not because it believed escalation would work, but because it could not imagine doing anything else. To pause would be to reflect. To reflect would be to doubt. Doubt was the one enemy the Imperium could not tolerate. The clerk watched this unfold from the margins, his access gradually curtailed as security tightened and information flow narrowed. He was no longer trusted, not because he was suspected, but because the system no longer trusted anyone who remembered too much. Institutional memory was dangerous. It invited uncomfortable connections. It suggested that the present might be shaped by the past in ways the Imperium preferred to deny. He saw colleagues reassigned without explanation, files sealed without review, entire departments quietly dissolved, their functions absorbed by automated processes that could not question orders or feel unease. The Imperium was simplifying itself in the face of crisis, shedding complexity in favor of brute force. It was becoming more efficient, and more blind. In private moments, the clerk tried to imagine what the Emperor would think if he could still speak. Not the god of sermons and banners, but the architect who had once planned humanity's survival with ruthless pragmatism. He suspected the truth would be unbearable. That the Emperor had always known this moment would come. That the Imperium was never meant to be flawless, only resilient enough to endure its own failures. But resilience required friction, required hesitation, required the courage to leave some things unresolved. The clerk had removed that hesitation. As the crisis deepened, fragments of the old design resurfaced in unexpected places. Half-remembered doctrines quoted by dying strategists. Obscure litanies recited by tech priests who did not know their origin. All of them hinted at the same forgotten principle, that some threats grew stronger the more they were confronted, and weaker the longer they were ignored. These fragments arrived too late, stripped of context and authority. Without the planet's original classification to anchor them, they were dismissed as superstition or coincidence. The Imperium could not reconnect the pieces because the framework that once held them together no longer existed. The clerk realized then that even if he were to confess everything, every doubt, every discovery, it would change nothing. The Imperium was already committed to a path it could not abandon without unraveling itself. His error had not merely doomed a plan, it had reshaped the Imperium's understanding of reality. The lie had become foundational. And foundations, once set, are not questioned. They are built upon. Somewhere beyond the reach of charts and censuses, the thing that had once been bound by neglect now moved freely, shaped by the attention it received. The Imperium named it, categorized it, and in doing so, gave it definition and strength. What had been a contained absence became a present force. The clerk felt no relief in this understanding. Only a cold certainty that the end, whatever form it took, would not be sudden. It would be administrative, measured in memos and casualty projections, sanitized by language that turned extinction into acceptable loss. The Emperor's grand plan had not failed in fire or rebellion. It was failing now, slowly and methodically, through perfectly reasonable decisions made by people who believed they were doing the right thing. And the most terrifying part was not that it had happened once, but that the Imperium, unchanged in its nature, was already preparing to do it again. The clerk knew it was happening long before anyone else acknowledged it. From his position deep within the bureaucratic heart of the Administratum, he watched as anomalies multiplied. Fleet deployments that should have been synchronized diverged inexplicably. Supply chains that had functioned for centuries began to fail. Communications across entire systems became unreliable, and the bureaucrats who depended on certainty reacted with predictable, procedural panic. Yet none of them could see the true cause, because the cause was the system itself, order, pursued without comprehension. He saw the first casualties as abstract numbers at first. Planets failing to meet tight expectations. Worlds slipping off contingency lists. Population losses. Catalogued in ledger sheets as routine attrition. Each figure was cleanly recorded, neatly filed, and utterly detached from the chaos it represented. This detachment, the very thing he had once admired as the Imperium's strength, was what made the unfolding catastrophe unstoppable. For years, he wrestled privately with the truth. The systems were failing not because of external threats, not because of rebellion or chaos, but because the Imperium's own obsessive drive for procedural correctness had eliminated the subtle frictions that kept certain threats contained. Each small correction he had made decades ago had propagated like ripples across a lake, touching countless processes in ways no human, or machine, could track. He began to trace the failures. It was painstaking work, cross-referencing lost convoys, anomalous warp signals, missing military deployments. Slowly, he saw the pattern emerge, a network of dependencies that had relied on careful neglect. That network was unraveling,